Teresa Eli, Program Co-Chairperson, will introduce our speakers, Dr. Silverman and Julie Fisher. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. I am so honored to introduce our speakers tonight, and I'm so grateful for the time that they have allotted us to give this presentation. It's always wonderful to shine a new light on our history here in this area. We have Julie Fisher tonight, is an advanced graduate student at the University of Delaware. She is completing a dissertation about Indians and colonists in 17th century New England who speak each other's languages. David Silverman is a professor of history at George Washington University. He is the author and editor of 6 books. His current project is a history of American Indians, adaptation of firearms. And Dr. Silverman has one of his books here tonight that he'll be discussing with us. So please give them a warm welcome.
I just want to make sure I'm projecting all right. Can everyone in the back row hear me okay? If you have any trouble at any point, give me this signal. And either I or my co-author Julie will be sure to speak up. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak before you today. This is just one of several talks that Julie and I have given on our co-authored book in southwestern Rhode Island. And we've always just been struck by the intense historical sensibility among the people of this region. We're always met not only by robust crowds, but by sharp, intelligent questions during our question and answer period, and we certainly invite that exchange today as soon as we're done with the formal presentation. We also want to make sure to acknowledge that what we're doing here today is we're speaking about a figure, the Sachem Ninigret, who played a pivotal role in the history of the Narragansett people, and we're acutely aware that we're speaking here today in Narragansett country. We want to acknowledge and honor that fact. We also want to, we're at pains to emphasize this point. This is our interpretation of the life story of the Sachem Ninigret. We don't pretend for a moment that this is a story that the Narragansetts themselves would tell about this figure. We appreciate and we know that many Narragansett people have a very different take on this historical figure than the one that we're presenting to you today. What we're presenting here is our interpretation about this figure, which leads to a larger point about the exercise of writing history, which is history is not just a series of facts waiting to be discovered and presented. What historians do is they present an interpretation of those facts, which means that those facts, what are considered to be the facts, can be argued over, but how one interprets those facts will be argued over and over and over again as every subsequent generation goes to the historical record with its own concern. So with that caveat, I'd like to dive into the story of our book. Now what we're here to do today is to speak about a biography which we recently wrote about Ninigret, a name that's doubtlessly familiar to all of you in this region as you zip back and forth past the Ninigret Park. But Ninigret is more than just a namesake of a park. He was a sachem, or chief, if you will, of the local Niantics and of the larger group, the Narragansetts, during the 17th century. Now in this book, we're making one basic contention, and that is that Ninigret was the most significant Indian leader in southern New England during the critical era between the Pequot War of 1636-37 and King Philip's War of 1675-76. Our focus in this book is not just on Ninigret and the Narragansetts' relations with the English, although that certainly is one of our concerns. But rather, we're also interested in the internal politics of the Narragansett people and the Narragansetts' intertribal diplomacy and warfare. So in other words, we're interested in politics within and between Indian groups, as well as between Native people and the English. In other words, we're painting a multipolar political picture of southeastern New England during the 17th century. And we think that by taking those kinds of multipolar political concerns and moving them front and center, it reveals that Ninigret and all of the people of the region during that period operated in a complex world of shifting coalitions, putting together, breaking apart, and then re-amalgamating different tribes and colonies over and over and over again. Very often what you find during this period is some tribes and some colonies allied together against another coalition of tribes and colonies. In other words, our automatic assumption that Indians and English were pit against each other, it doesn't often work that way on the ground during this period of time. We also contend in this book that Ninigret's ambition to rise from the leader of the small community of Niantics, located right here in Charlestown, Rhode Island, to become a leading voice among the much larger tribe of the Narragansetts, with whom the Niantics were affiliated. We argue that that ambition played a formative role in how Ninigret navigated this multipolar political world. So those are the basic arguments of the book. In terms of the framing of the book, Ninigret's adult life, and we're focused on his adult life, of course. His adult life was bracketed by the two major Indian colonial conflicts in 17th century New England, the Pequot War and King Philip's War. Now, the stories of those two events have been told over and over and over again, ad nauseum, some of my students might say. And most recently, those stories have been told with increased attention to the Indian effort. Why were they behaving the way they did? What were their concerns? What were their strategies? But we hold that moving Ninigret to the front and center of those events helps us see them in a new light. It also helps us see the 40 years between them in a whole new light. So with that, let's turn to the story. What you're seeing here is a map of southern New England. It includes the modern day state lines, which were very much fluid and contested during the 17th century, let me emphasize. But this is a map of southern New England, noting the locations of the major colonies, the major tribes, and the major settlements during that period. Now, typically, the Pequot War of 1636 and 37 is told as the result of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a mere 7 years old, demanding the Pequots of southeastern Connecticut to turn over the indigenous murderers of a ne'er-do-well trading captain named John Stone and his crew. And then the Pequots refusing to comply. So you have this new colony demanding the Pequots to turn over accused murderers to English justice, as the English defined it. The Narragansetts and the Mohegans entered this war on the English side, but for their very own particular reasons. The Narragansetts saw an opportunity by siding with the English to defeat their primary rival for wampum-paying tributaries, and Pequots were their main rival. And the Mohegans, for their part, under the Sachem Uncas, saw an opportunity to free themselves from tributary status to the Pequots. During the 17th century, southern New England Indian societies were organized in one respect into tributary-paying relationships with powerful communities collecting tribute, largely in the form of wampum beads, which I'm sure many people in this room are familiar with, beads made out of quahog and periwinkle shells. Smaller communities would pay tribute to the larger communities and very often didn't have a choice in the matter. The Narragansetts wanted to replace the Pequots as the main tribute collecting tribe in the region. The Mohegans wanted to free themselves from paying tribute to the Pequots. This is very well documented, and we don't quibble with this perspective at all. We do hold, however, that emphasis overlooks the critical role of Ninigret in the Pequot War. And let me explain. One of the reasons the English of Massachusetts Bay were so insistent on punishing the murders of John Stone and his crew was that this murder was quickly followed by another, that of another English trader named John Oldham. And in this case, Oldham was killed at the hands of the Manasees of Block Island, a group that paid tribute to the Narragansetts. Oldham's murder in July of 1636, barely a year after the murder of John Stone and his crew, made English authorities fear that Indians in southeastern New England had concluded that they could slay Englishmen wherever and whenever they pleased. Well, based on Indian eyewitness testimony, extracted, by the way, under interrogation. So we all know the issues that surround evidence extracted under those conditions. But Indian eyewitness testimony extracted under harsh interrogation leads us to believe that Ninigret was one of the ringleaders behind the Manasees of Block Island's killing of John Oldham. And the reason that Ninigret was involved, we contend, had as much to do with the domestic and foreign politics of the Narragansetts as it had to do with Ninigret's relations with the English. Let me explain. So the Manasees of Block Island killed John Oldham in Block Island Sound at sea, shortly after Oldham had extended his trade from the Narragansetts to the Pequots. Originally, he had set up an exclusive trading relationship with the Narragansetts. But then, he begins trading also with the Pequots. To the Narragansetts, that move, his decision to start trading with their enemies, transformed him from a friend to something more like an enemy. Ninigret, we argue, had the Manasees murder John Oldham in part to cut the Pequots off from this trade. He had no interest in seeing them acquire metal hatchets, metal knives, even guns, gunpowder, and shot. What's more, he wanted to murder Oldham in order to teach English traders a lesson. Don't take on the Niantics and Narragansetts. We also assert that murdering John Oldham was a way for a young Ninigret, and we guess that he's in his 20s about this point in time. We argue that murdering Oldham was a way for this young Ninigret to assert his prominence within the larger Narragansett community. In Indian country, a young man's claim to leadership rested on a number of different factors. His family history, who he married, much like the dynastic politics of Europe, and bold action, often against the wishes of older, wiser, more moderate leaders. And this is a built-in structure in Native society. Older leaders who have already established their credentials as warriors, as politicians, as traders, are always counseling young men not to behave as rashly as they did when they were establishing their leadership credentials. Now, Ninigret had the family ties, no question. He was related to the leading Narragansett sachems, Quonochontaug and his nephew, Niantics. Ninigret certainly had the marriages, having apparently, and we're not sure about this, but he appears to have married Niantics' sister, as well as at least 2 other high-ranking women, unnamed, throughout the region. He might have had more wives. All we know is from the documentary record is that he certainly had 3. But as leader of the small Niantic community, he had to prove his ability to get things done before he could claim a voice in the larger group of the Narragansetts. We argue that murdering Oldham was one of the ways he accomplished this goal. He proved he could act boldly on an international stage. Well, if that was his purpose, the strategy worked. The English would have liked to chastise Ninigret for the Oldham killing, and they debated it. They debated sending an army into Charlestown, Rhode Island, in order to attack Ninigret and the Niantics. But they decided that they did not dare, because if they did, it would cross the leading Narragansett sachems, Quonochontaug and Niantics, who told them right up front, the Niantics are blood. They said they're our family. We see them as one people with us. So to attack the Niantics was for the English to have a war with the larger Narragansetts. Instead, the English decided to pick easier targets. They sent punitive expeditions against the Manasees and the Pequots, and these ultimately became the opening blows in the Pequot War. At the same time, we believe that one of the reasons that Quonochontaug and Niantics contributed Narragansett warriors to the English campaign against the Pequots was not only because they wanted to replace the Pequots as the main tribute collecting power in the region. We also believe that Niantics and Quonochontaug wanted to distance their people from a crisis that Ninigret had helped to create. In other words, they were showing the English that the Narragansetts as a whole are not enemies of the English, that this was just a rogue sachem acting against their wishes, and that they were now helping to bring him back to heel. At the end of the day, Ninigret got off scot-free, and in so doing, we believe, he enhanced his political profile within the larger Native community. And he needed that larger profile, because the seeming 40 years of peace following the Pequot War up to King Philip's War were in fact a period of endless intrigue, crisis, and political realignment within Indian country and in Indian-English relations. The basic feature of Indian politics and Indian colonial relations during this period, we argue, was the rivalry between the Narragansetts and the Mohegans, represented in the personas of Ninigret and the Mohegan sachem Uncas. What you see here is Uncas's sign. So the English would write Uncas, his mark, and then Uncas would draw this figure here. What you're seeing here is this is a man with his hands on his hips, and what you see is a large chest with a big beating heart, which symbolically means he means what he says, and well, he'll follow what he says as well. No sooner had the Pequot War ended than the Narragansetts and the Mohegans began competing with each other to absorb the survivors, to absorb the surviving Pequots and adopt them into their communities. They also competed to receive the payments that the Pequots used to receive from other native people in the region, particularly wampum-producing peoples on Long Island, like the Montaukets and the Shinnecocks. They also competed for Pequot hunting grounds. So, this rivalry is multifaceted. There's a lot at stake here. Well, the competition between the Narragansetts and the Mohegans quickly led to outright war, and Uncas's capture and eventual killing of the main Narragansett sachem, Niantics. After Uncas's killing of Niantics, and I should add, Uncas's killing of Niantics after the Narragansetts had paid a ransom for his life, which only infuriated the Narragansetts more. After Niantics' killing at the hands of Uncas, Ninigret made it his personal quest to revenge this killing. And this is a mission, we believe, that he symbolized by changing his name from Janamo to Ninigret and adopting as his symbol a stone warhammer, which you see here. So Ninigret's name is reckoned in a variety of different ways by the English, as most Native names are. It's one of the great challenges of doing Native American history during this period. The English, they never write their own names the same way twice, but when they get Native names, it's even more of a mess. What you see is Nena Craft and Mark, and there you see his club. That's why the cover of the book has this stone warhammer on the front of it. Now, you might assume the choice of this signature was obvious. Ninigret intended to bash in Uncas's skull. And we could see that, for sure. No question about it. But there's also a measure of subtlety in his choice of a symbol. The stone hammer, which Ninigret used as a symbol, was a weapon that the Narragansetts often obtained through trade with the powerful Mohawks of the Iroquois League, of upstate New York, just to the west of Albany. Some people have asked us, why there's stones all over southwestern Rhode Island. People will know this as well as anyone. Why are they trading for stone hammers from the Mohawks? The Mohawks have specialists, and they also have particular stones that are valued for these weapons. What's more, you very often see in Indian country native people trading with other people for materials they already have in order to solidify relations between them. So it's not just the object that they're getting that's valuable, it's the act of trading which solidifies a relationship between peoples. And there are numerous sources in which the English are quite worried that the Narragansetts obtained these stone weapons in trade from the Mohawks. Thus, we believe that in adopting the stone hammer as a symbol, Ninigret was sending a message to an English audience. After all, they were the ones who would see this. These documents are not for native consumption. They go back to English centers of power. And what do the English see? They see this stone club. Well, what is Ninigret trying to say? Well, the English were Uncas's protectors. The protectors of Uncas and the Mohegans. They offered the Mohegans military backing and trade in exchange for intelligence about goings-on in Indian country and cheap sales of land. So Uncas is really the colonists' main Indian ally in southeastern New England during this period of time. To offset this axis, binding together the Mohegans and the English, Ninigret looked to recruit allies from abroad. And those allies included the Quonochontags of the Connecticut River Valley, and most importantly, the Mohawks of the Mohawk River Valley of what's now upstate New York. He recruited those allies in no small degree, and try to stay with me here. He recruited allies like the Pequot and the Mohawks by extorting tribute in wampum from the Long Island tribes like the Montaukets, who were also under English protection, and then sending those wampum beads to those foreign tribes he was looking to make an alliance with. So in other words, who he collects tribute from allows him to extend his network of allies abroad. So what we're suggesting here is that Ninigret's choice of a stone war club as a signature was his way of announcing that the Mohawks were his answer to the English support of Uncas and the Mohegans, and that he would continue to raid anyone who he wanted to obtain the wampum that secured his relationship with the Mohawks. It's a complex political game that he's playing here. Now, Ninigret looked to Europeans as allies too, which shows, and I think this is an important point, that colonists were no less vulnerable to divide and conquer tactics than Indians were. We very often hear about the English using divide and conquer against native people. Native people used it against the English too. Let us not forget, New England wasn't one colony. And those colonies did not get along. Yeah, there was several different colonies, and not just the ones that immediately spring to mind. There were independent English settlements on Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, on Long Island. New Haven was separate from Connecticut. Plymouth was separate from Massachusetts. Well, Ninigret's and the Narragansetts' closest ally among the English colonies was, of course, Long Island. For any of you having trouble getting your bearings, we're here right now. I can see the building from this perspective. Rhode Island, because of its heterodox religious makeup, was excluded from the military alliance of Puritan colonies known as the United Colonies of New England. That was an alliance that banded together Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven, but not Rhode Island. Bunch of pagans. In any case, Rhode Island, as you might know, was a small, struggling collection of communities during this period, always at risk of being annexed forcibly by Massachusetts or Connecticut, which is why some of its colonists, foremost among them Roger Williams and Samuel Gorton, committed themselves to working with rather than against the Narragansetts. They needed the Narragansetts to protect Rhode Island against encroachments by Massachusetts and Connecticut. Well, Rhode Island, in turn, assisted the Narragansetts in their dealings with other Englishmen. The best example comes in 1644, when Samuel Gorton, who I might add is the most fascinating religious figure in 17th century New England. He is impossible to categorize. Incredible mix of heterodoxies. I love it. But in any case, in 1644, Samuel Gorton left Warwick and went to London to broker a deal in which the Narragansetts formally subjected themselves to Charles I, the King of England. By the way, this basically required nothing of the tribe. Charles I is not going to exercise authority in Narragansett country, particularly when he has his hands full with a Puritan Civil War. But in exchange for them subjecting themselves to Charles I, the tribe got royal protection against the Puritan colonies. And Charles I and his family hated Puritans. He'd eventually lose his head to them, so it's understandable. But in any case, this relationship ultimately foiled the Puritan colonies' repeated attempts to seize both Narragansett land and annex Rhode Island. So it's Rhode Island and the Narragansetts working together with the king against the United Colonies of New England. Ninigret also looked to the Dutch of New Netherland, what we now call New York, for alliance. By the way, this is one of my favorite images from the 17th century. This is a Dutch depiction of southern Manhattan. Basically what you're seeing here is the route that the ferry from Staten Island takes to the Bowling Green. And that would be the Bowling Green right there. Wall Street, which was indeed a wall, and Canal Street, which was indeed a canal, are just to the north in the wilderness of Manhattan during this period of time. Now, the Dutch in the Hudson River Valley exercised an influence in what's now the Northeast United States, disproportionate to their numbers. And let me note that the population of New Netherland was always less than the population of just Connecticut. But New Netherland was an important place for this reason, because the Dutch were the biggest suppliers of guns, powder, and shot to the Native American market in Northeast America. The Dutch are basically the arsenal of Europe during the early 17th century, and they are literally unloading munitions into Indian country during this period of time in exchange for beaver pelts, which they then traded back in Europe. What's more, the Dutch, from their position on the Hudson River, including Albany, on the upper Hudson River, had close ties to the Mohawks and the other nations of the Five Nations Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, of whom the Mohawks were one member nation. Well, Ninigret saw the possibilities in a friendship with the Dutch, and so in 1653, at the very beginning of a Dutch-English naval war, of which there were 3 during the 17th century, he traveled all the way from what's now Charlestown, Rhode Island, to the Dutch colonial capital of New Amsterdam in Manhattan, and met with the Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant. Along the way, he visited with sachems on both sides of Long Island Sound and throughout the lower Hudson River Valley. Precisely what he was doing is veiled in mystery. We have intelligence, but the intelligence is faulty. Much of it comes from Uncas, which means it's difficult to trust. Other intelligence comes from groups that Ninigret was collecting tribute from. They're trying to free him. So we have to be very careful with this evidence. But rumors spread by Uncas and other rivals charge that Ninigret and the Dutch had hatched a plan to combine Dutch and Indian forces and lay siege to the English colonies. We think not. Rather, we suspect that Ninigret and the Dutch were reaching out to each other as defensive allies, with the Dutch enlisting the help of Ninigret if the English attacked New Netherland, and Ninigret enlisting Dutch aid if the English attacked him because of his attacks on the Mohegans and the Indians of Long Island. Now, disagreements among the United Colonies of New England's commissioners, fostered in part by Ninigret's oblique answers to their charges, prevented this crisis from becoming a war, but just barely. what the great crisis that we know of as King Philip's War could have happened 20 years earlier, during this crisis in the 1650s. That is how close New England was during this period to a general conflagration. Ninigret simply, and by the way, here's his territory again. Ninigret simply did not recognize English authority in his affairs, and nothing they did forced him to submit. During the 1650s, the United Colonies of New England sent 3 armed expeditions against Ninigret, right into this territory here. But each time, Ninigret got out of it. Once, by making a false promise to get the Narragansetts to pay a steep fine in wampum and to end their raids on the Mohegans and the Montaukets. Another time, by meeting English troops down the road from here with an equally formidable band of gun-toting warriors and some Mohawk warriors. And by the way, the English couldn't miss that Ninigret's men were all wielding Dutch guns. And then one other time by swamping himself, as the English called it, which means going and hiding in a swamp until the English, frustrated, just left. And even as the New England colonies grew, and they grew like topsy, I should mention parenthetically, New England is the one colonial region, the one, including the Caribbean, where women accompanied men. Only Pennsylvania, many years later, would match this record. There's young men and young women, and boy did they have families. Women had on average 8 children over the course of their lives. And they lived long lives. Colonial New England had more people living into their 80s and even 90s than almost any society in the Western world during this period of time. This is a recipe for a population explosion. And that's what Native people have to live with. But even as the colonies grow and begin to rival the native population, Ninigret remained as defiant as ever. When English officials tried to interfere in the Narragansetts' intertribal politics, Ninigret responded, "I do but right my own quarrel." Now, many people would say, well, how do we know he said that? Look, we don't. This is an interpreter. This is probably going through at least one layer of interpretation before an English scribe is writing it down. But the English don't want to hear these words. And yet, they're working their way onto the page. For us, as historians, making our assessment of the evidence, words like that ring true. They resonate with Ninigret's behavior. I'll give you another example. When the colonies threatened Ninigret with armed force, he countered over and over again that he could bring as many Mohawks to his side as there were Englishmen who protected Uncas. This, by the way, is a 17th century French drawing of a Mohawk warrior during this period of time, conspicuously posing with a Dutch flintlock musket. Together, Ninigret was reported to say, the Narragansetts and the Mohawks, and this is my favorite quote of Ninigret, Ninigret charged that together, Narragansett warriors and Mohawk warriors would, and I quote, lay the English cattle on heaps as high as their houses. In other words, we'll pile your dead cattle as high as your homes. And he charged that no Englishman should stir out of his house to piss, that he should be killed. That's a threat. I don't think this rings true to us. We don't believe the English are conjuring up these nightmares by themselves. And this is no mere bluster. In 1659, Narragansett and Quonochontaug warriors punctuated a 2-year military campaign against Uncas by striking Mohegans wherever they found them, even among the English. One such attack targeted the Connecticut home of Jonathan Brewster, who, not coincidentally, provided the Mohegans with firearms and protection. So he's an ally of the Mohegans, therefore he's an enemy of the Narragansetts. Narragansett warriors forced themselves into Brewster's home looking for weapons and Mohegan enemies. They hatcheted a Mohegan who was holding on for dear life to the waist of Brewster's wife, and then riddled Brewster's homestead with 11 bullet shots. Now, Ninigret and the Narragansetts didn't seek confrontation with the English. The issue here was that the English were protecting Mohegans. But they would not tolerate the English harboring and aiding Narragansett enemies. Not at all. With that, I want to turn over this talk to my co-author, and I should note my wife, just in case you were wondering, Julie Fisher. Julie?
Good evening. So, studying Ninigret also forces us to rethink one of the most basic, fundamental issues in Indian colonial affairs: land sales. You cannot tell the story if you do not talk about land sales. So what we have here is actually, and some of you may be familiar with it, one of the earliest documents we have of the land sale of parts of Rhode Island from Niantics and Canonicus, and you can see Niantics' arrow here in Canonicus. This is actually a bow. Sometimes people mistake it for a boat. It's a bow, because often the arrow will go right here, and you can see it's a bow and arrow. So the Narragansetts made a spat of land sales between 1657 and 1660, culminating in two notorious deals, and that is the Pequot purchase of 1658 and the infamous Atherton mortgage of 1660. So these deals gave a group of Rhode Island speculators in the first instance, and a corporation of mostly Massachusetts and Connecticut land speculators in the second, claims to practically all of Narragansett country. Ninigret was one of the signatories on these deeds. So generally, historians have seen the Narragansetts as dupes in all of this, tricked by colonists who plied them with liquor and then exploited their unfamiliarity with real estate vocabulary to get them to sign away their homeland. We have a very, very different view. First and foremost, we believe the Narragansetts used these land sales to acquire wampum and weapons for use in their diplomacy and warfare, as we've been mentioning, against the Mohegans and Montaukets. And here what I like to show is my students that I teach this to in Delaware, they have no idea what a quahog is. They have none. So I talk about wampum and quahogs, and I finally realized, oh no, they don't know why I'm talking about purple or white. So this is less for your benefit than for students. But then I tell my students that everyone in Rhode Island laughs that they don't know what this is. So all this time then, right, so Ninigret is selling this land to acquire wampum and weapons for use in his diplomacy against Mohegans and Montaukets. So conspicuously, these sales overlap with the Narragansetts' renewed campaigns against those tribes. Furthermore, we doubt the Narragansetts ever expected the land sales to take effect. Stay with me here. You have to put yourself in a very, very different mindset. The English would have had to fight to take possession of Narragansett land. And as you've heard, they've been very unwilling, even reluctant to do so in the past. And in any case, this issue quickly became moot. No sooner had the Atherton Company claimed the legal right to Narragansett territory than in 1660, Charles II returned to the throne. He promptly nullified the Atherton claim and declared Narragansett country to be under royal protection and off limits to English settlement because the Narragansetts, as you now know, had submitted themselves to his father Charles I back in 1644. And actually, you should know that the actual document that they produced, that the Narragansetts produced, that Samuel Gordon had produced in 1644, he's carefully been keeping these past 20 years. So when it comes into question, he's actually able to find it in his house and bring it to authorities. So that's why you keep track of your papers. So Ninigret and the Narragansetts were not simply victims in this affair. They were savvy players of Machiavellian politics. Now, of all the challenges Ninigret faced over his long life, none proved greater than King Philip's War of 1675 and 1676. And Philip we have here, we don't have any portraits, but we do know that this was his mark. And some people believe that if you notice, at first it looks just like a P. But if you notice the top of the P, there's a little more of an emphasis. And at the bottom as well, we've actually seen stone clubs that have very similar features. So anytime any sort of sachem like Philip is signing his name, you would best believe he's choosing his mark very carefully to convey multiple meanings. So our view is that Philip, again, this young Wampanoag sachem, had been trying to organize a multi-tribal uprising against the English since the 1660s. Though Ninigret, as you've heard, had been a firebrand in English affairs for the better part of 30 years, by the late 1660s, both he and the political landscape had changed. At this point, even though we like to think of historical actors as always being the same age and they just stay either old or young the entire time, at this point Ninigret is now 70 years old. This is not an age at which sachems normally lead their people to war. As an older man, his interest was to pass on what he had built to his son and his daughter. He certainly had no stake in launching a young Wampanoag sachem like Philip into power, which of course Philip's rise can only come at the Narragansetts' expense. Yet Ninigret's most important consideration was probably the Mohawks, who by then were in no position to lend their support to a campaign against the English. And here just an overview of where the Mohawks fall in the larger Iroquois or the Five Nations area. So in the 1660s, the Mohawks already had their hands full warring against the French of Canada and increasingly the Indians of the Connecticut River Valley, including the Pequontaugs. Additionally, the English, having conquered New Netherland in 1664, founding the colony of New York, had recently replaced the Dutch as the Mohawks' supplier of firearms. The Mohawks could not afford to lose the trade of New York by warring against the colonies of New England. As Ninigret's long-standing campaign against the Mohegans and Montaukets demonstrated, he considered the Mohawks essential, the essential indigenous counterweight to English power. Ninigret knew that without the Mohawk support, Philip's campaign faced incredible odds. So we treat then King Philip's War not just as an Indian-English conflict or even a war with Indians on both sides. We also see it as an internal Narragansett War, which is to say a fracturing of Narragansett society over which side to support. And again here, this is just to give you a larger idea of King Philip's War and the scope of King Philip's War. As the war began, many Narragansetts, including Ninigret's sister, Quonochontaug, were in favor of joining Philip's campaign against the English. Ninigret was opposed. Caught in the middle were sachems like Pesicus, who preferred peace, while heading a community clamoring for war. Yet the balance of Narragansett opinion shifted decidedly in favor of joining Philip during the fall and early winter of 1675 as Wampanoag non-combatants began fleeing to the Narragansetts in search of refuge. The English demanded the Narragansetts to turn the Wampanoags over to them, probably for sale into slavery. And where they're selling slaves, where the English are selling Indian slaves at this time is actually out to the islands, specifically for sugar plantations. And if you know anything about sugar plantations, that is a death sentence. The Narragansetts refused. They refused to hand over these Wampanoag refugees and signaled their resolution with a marriage between the Narragansett sachem Quonochontaug and the Wampanoag Sunk-Squaw, that's a female sachem, a female leader, Weedamoo. The English, urged on by Uncas, interpreted the Narragansetts' actions as hostility and credited uncertain intelligence that the Narragansetts would join Philip's campaign in the spring. Unwilling to leave the matter to chance, the united colonies marched over 500 men into Narragansett country in December of 1675, destroying 2 Narragansett settlements and then besieging the Narragansett Great Swamp Fort in modern Kingston. And here we have a picture of the swamp. David and I actually didn't understand how anyone could swamp themselves until we actually came up and saw what the swamps were like here. You actually could hide yourself. So in the Great Swamp, English soldiers shot down and burned hundreds of mostly non-combatants and drove the rest of those survivors into Philip's camp. So, and again, these movements of King Philip's were to show you this larger scope. In the lead up to this massacre, Ninigret had managed to separate himself and his Niantics from the rest of the Narragansetts communities. No small feat. He did so by delivering Wampanoag heads and Wampanoag captives to the English. He even proposed a grandiose peace plan, which would have had him traveling throughout Indian country, urging other nations to leave Philip to his own devices. And most remarkably, Ninigret managed to keep Niantic young men from doing anything which the English could read as hostility. And this is during a time when truly both sides, English leaders, Indian leaders, are struggling to control their young men. Because you might remember, you rise up in society by proving yourself in war. So this new generation of men are looking for opportunities to prove themselves. While the older leaders are saying, please, don't do this. Despite Ninigret's history, he proves a notable exception. So with all his confrontations in the past, and his reputation among colonists as, and I quote, colonists called Ninigret insolent, crafty, contemptible, proud, and fierce. English authorities recognized him as committed to peace during this time of very uncertain loyalties. Ninigret and the Niantics would have preferred to remain neutral during the war, but the English made neutrality for Indians almost impossible. Ninigret and the Niantics, after burying the Narragansett dead in the Great Swamp, and then keeping their heads low for months, reluctantly raised 20 warriors to fight alongside the English and their longtime enemies, the Mohawks, in the late spring of 1676. It was a campaign that, to their horror, ended with a clash between other Narragansetts and the capture and execution of a very prominent Narragansett war leader named Quonochontaug. Yet this service kept the Niantics out of harm's way. Ninigret stayed alive just long enough to see the Niantics through this crisis. By the fall of 1676, when the war in southern New England was practically over, Ninigret died. So, coming back again to Ninigret's mark to represent him, there are deep ironies in the end of his life. He had spent a career building far-flung Indian coalitions to meet English threats, and he had been the center of one English war scare after another. Yet he became a reluctant ally of the English during their moment of greatest peril. He did so, of course, we argue, not for any love of the English, but in pursuit of what he viewed as the best interest for the Niantic. It is also ironic that in breaking with the Narragansetts, he might have seen himself as acting in their interest too. It is possible, even probable, that he provided the Narragansetts with intelligence, supplies, and refuge for non-combatants during the war. After the war, the Niantics certainly took in an unspecified number of Narragansett survivors. The Niantics even took on the Narragansett tribal name after a number of years. A final irony is that Ninigret's namesakes and successors showed little of his political savvy and ruthlessness in leading the Narragansetts after his death. Rather, they presided over a century of Narragansett land loss and impoverishment. But that legacy does not belong to Ninigret. The Narragansetts remained a regional power throughout his lifetime, and in no small part because of his leadership. He should be counted, for all these reasons we argued, as one of the most significant figures of this era. Thank you.